The year is 1697. A cold wind blows over the bustling docks of Amsterdam. The air is thick with the scent of salt and sawdust. The sound of hammers striking wood echoes across the shipyard. Men shout in Dutch as they build great vessels, ships that will soon command the seas. Among these workers is a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a gaze as sharp as a blade. His hands are rough from labor, his clothes simple, blending him into the crowd. But this is no ordinary man. This is Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, the Tsar of Russia. A ruler with absolute power over millions. A man who could, with a single word, order executions, build armies, or declare war. Yet here, in the heart of Western Europe, he is not a Tsar. He is a student. He is an apprentice. Because Peter knows a truth that few in Russia dare to accept, his empire is weak. While the rest of Europe builds fleets, forges cannons, and expands across oceans, Russia is trapped in the past. Its armies are poorly trained, its navy non-existent, its cities frozen in medieval traditions. And Peter will not accept this. He has seen what modern Europe can do, the power of ships, the precision of artillery, the wealth of trade. And he knows that if Russia does not change, it will fall. Peter is here for a purpose. He will study shipbuilding, learn the secrets of Western warfare, and bring that knowledge home. And when he returns to Russia, he will drag his empire into the future, through fire, through steel, and through blood. He will break the old ways, crush those who stand in his path, and force his nation into greatness. He will build a navy from nothing, carve a new city from the swamps, and defeat the mighty Swedish Empire, establishing Russia as a power that Europe will fear and respect. But progress will come at a cost. There will be rebellions, betrayals, and mass executions. Thousands will die to fulfill his vision. Because Peter the Great is not just a reformer, he is a force of nature. How did a boy Tsar, scarred by violence and palace intrigue, rise to become the man who reshaped Russia forever? How did his relentless drive for power and progress birth a modern empire? And at what human cost was this transformation achieved? This is the story of Peter the Great, the Tsar who built an empire. Russia, in the late 1600s, was not the vast superpower we know today. It was a land trapped in the past. While the rest of Europe surged forward into a new age of progress, science, and naval exploration, Russia remained isolated. It was a country of snow-covered forests, sprawling plains, and ancient traditions. A place where power rested in the hands of one man, the Tsar, an absolute ruler whose word was law. But this Tsar did not rule a modern nation. Russia's people were mostly peasants, serfs, tied to the land like slaves, their lives dictated by the will of noble landowners. Villages were primitive, cities were small and undeveloped, and roads turned to rivers of mud in the spring thaw. The Russian army was strong in numbers but weak in tactics, relying on brute force rather than strategy. But the navy? There was no navy. Russia had no access to warm seaports, and without ports, there was no fleet, no trade, and no power on the seas. This was a kingdom isolated from Europe, cut off by vast forests, icy rivers, and the towering Ural Mountains. But perhaps the greatest wall between Russia and the West was its culture. The Russian Orthodox Church held immense power, and its leaders saw Western ideas as corrupt and dangerous. Men wore long beards as symbols of their faith. The nobility, known as the boyars, clung to old customs and resisted change at every turn. Russia was a land bound by tradition, ruled by fear, and untouched by the progress sweeping through Europe. It was a nation frozen in time. But change was coming. And it would come with fire and blood. On June 9, 1672, a child was born in Moscow, into the House of Romanov, the ruling dynasty of Russia. His name was Pyotr Alexeyevich, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov. He was the 14th child of Tsar Alexei, a ruler who had brought relative stability to Russia, but whose reign was still haunted by the violence and chaos of the past. Peter's mother was Natalia Narishkina, a woman of humble roots, which made her position at court a source of tension. Because in the palace, alliances were as deadly as swords. When Tsar Alexei died in 1676, the struggle for power tore the Romanov family apart. The throne passed to Peter's older half-brother, Feofor III. But Feofor was sickly, and when he died in 1682, the question of succession plunged the empire into violence. On one side was Peter, supported by his mother Natalia and her Narishkin family. On the other side was Peter's older half-sister Sophia, and the Miloslavsky family, who supported Peter's other half-brother, Ivan V, weak, nearly blind, and mentally unfit to rule. The conflict erupted into bloodshed. The Streltsy, the elite palace guards, rose up in revolt. They stormed the Kremlin, dragging noblemen from their homes, cutting them down with axes and spears. Peter, just 10 years old, hid in terror as he watched from a palace window. He saw men thrown from towers, their bodies broken on the cobblestones below. He saw his family butchered before his eyes. That day would scar him forever. Peter and Ivan V were declared joint Tsars, with Sophia acting as regent, the true power behind the throne. But Peter was just a child. He had the title of Tsar, but none of the power. And he never forgot the sight of blood on the palace walls. While Sophia ruled Moscow, Peter was sent away. He grew up in the countryside, away from the poisonous politics of the Kremlin. But this exile would shape him in ways no one expected. Because Peter was not like the other Tsars. While other noble children learned courtly manners, Peter was building forts, cannons and wooden warships. He formed his own army, boys from the village, drilling them like soldiers. He became obsessed with the military, but even more with the sea. In the German quarter of Moscow, he met European artisans, engineers and sailors, foreigners who brought ideas from the West. They told him of great fleets, modern cities, and nations that ruled the waves. Peter listened. He absorbed everything. He learned shipbuilding, how to fire artillery, and how to construct fortresses. He worked with his hands, something no Tsar had ever done. And deep inside him, a vision was taking shape. Russia would no longer be a prisoner of the past. Russia would become a modern power. But to build a new Russia, Peter would first need to seize the throne. And that would require crushing those who stood in his way. Peter the Great had seized the crown. The Kremlin was his. His sister Sophia was cast aside, locked away in a convent, her power stripped from her like a discarded robe. His frail half-brother, Ivan V, still wore the title of Khazar, but he was a figurehead, an empty shell. The true ruler of Russia was now Peter. But the crown alone was not what Peter wanted. He wanted something far greater. He wanted to transform Russia into a power that could stand alongside the mighty kingdoms of Europe. Yet, the Russia he inherited was ancient, stubborn, and fractured. It was a land where tradition ruled with an iron grip, where the Orthodox Church held sway over every aspect of life, and where the boyars, the noble families, clung to their old ways like armor against the future. Peter knew that if he was to build his vision of a new Russia, he would need to break the chains of the past. And breaking chains always draws blood. The boyars were the first obstacle. These nobles saw Peter's ideas as a threat to everything they valued, tradition, power, and their way of life. Peter looked to the west, to England, to Holland, to Prussia, and he saw a future where armies marched with discipline, where fleets of warships ruled the seas, and where cities rose like monuments to human progress. But when he looked at Russia, he saw bearded nobles draped in long, heavy robes, symbols of their orthodox faith and resistance to Western influence. Peter decided that the transformation of Russia would begin with them. One day, at a public gathering, Peter appeared with a pair of giant shears in his hand. He summoned the boyars forward, one by one. Before they could protest, he grabbed their beards, their sacred beards, seen as a symbol of piety, and began cutting them off. The crowd watched in horror as chunks of hair fell to the ground. For these men, it was not just hair, it was their dignity, their tradition, their faith. Peter laughed as he cut, declaring, "We must look to the future, not the past." Those who resisted faced fines, or worse. The boyars were humiliated. But Peter's message was clear: Russia would change, and no one was exempt. But beards were only the beginning. Peter abolished traditional Russian robes, forcing nobles to wear European coats and breeches. Banquets were no longer filled with silent rituals. Now men and women were ordered to mingle, to dance, to drink wine and speak freely, like the courts of France and England. For many in the old guard, this was not progress, it was blasphemy. But Peter did not care. Because while the nobles fretted over their clothes, Peter was building something far more dangerous, a modern army. Russia's military had always relied on sheer numbers, waves of poorly trained peasants hurling themselves at enemies. Peter wanted discipline. He wanted firepower. He wanted artillery that could shatter walls and fleets that could control the seas. He imported European officers, Dutch, German, Scottish, men who knew modern warfare. Russian recruits were drilled like never before, taught to march in formation, to reload muskets with precision, to fight as a machine, not a mob. Peter's army was taking shape, but he knew that land power alone was not enough. Russia was a prisoner, locked away from the sea. Without a navy, without ports, Russia would always be at the mercy of its enemies. Peter looked to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, to the places where Russia's future lay. And he knew that war was coming. But before Peter could launch his vision outward, Russia would bleed from within. The Streltsy, the palace guards, the same men who had murdered Peter's family when he was just a boy, rose up again. They were loyal to the old ways, to Sophia, to the past. Rumors spread that they planned to restore her to power. When Peter heard the whispers, he acted without mercy. The Streltsy were rounded up, tortured, beaten, broken. Peter did not delegate the punishment. He took part in it himself. Wielding an axe with his own hands, he beheaded the rebels. Some were hung from the city walls, others were impaled on spikes, their bodies left to rot in the streets as a message to all of Russia. The message was clear: Peter's Russia would rise, or it would drown in blood. But Peter was not done. Because Russia's transformation required more than soldiers and discipline. It required knowledge, the kind only the West could provide. And Peter was willing to leave his throne to get it. He would travel to the heart of Europe, not as a czar, but as a common man. And what he learned would change Russia forever. In 1697, Peter the Great did something no Russian czar had ever dared to do. He left his empire. He traveled west, not as a monarch, but in disguise, as a common laborer, using the name Pyotr Mikhailov. He walked the streets of Amsterdam, of London, of Vienna, not as a ruler, but as a student. In Dutch shipyards, Peter worked with his own hands, learning how to build ships, hammering planks alongside common carpenters. He studied the British Royal Navy, observed artillery drills in Austria, and visited factories that produced cannons capable of reducing fortresses to rubble. Everywhere he went, he asked questions, endlessly, obsessively, about navigation, fortifications, trade, and governance. But back in Russia, the old ways refused to die. While Peter was abroad, the Streltsy rose up once more. They marched on Moscow, calling for Sophia's return. Peter rushed home, and he brought vengeance with him. Thousands of rebels were executed. Men were hung in the streets, their corpses swaying in the wind. Peter even hung some outside Sophia's convent window, forcing her to stare at the rotting faces of her supporters. This was no longer just a power struggle. This was a revolution by fire. Peter demanded loyalty, not to the past, but to the future he was forging with his own hands. The army was rebuilt, trained with Western discipline. The navy was born. Shipyards sprang up along Russia's rivers and coasts. Peter declared that Russia would no longer be a landlocked kingdom. It would sail the seas, trade with the West, and defend itself with fleets as powerful as any in Europe. But Peter's vision would require one final step. War. Because Russia needed ports, ice-free ports. And those ports belonged to the Swedes and the Ottomans. Peter was ready to fight. But Europe had not yet seen what Peter the Great was truly capable of. And soon, the world would learn that when Peter declared war, it was not simply a conflict. It was a transformation. Peter the Great had returned to Russia, but he had not come home as the same man who left. He had seen what the West had to offer: fleets of powerful warships, disciplined armies, and cities that hummed with trade and wealth. He had seen what Russia could become. And now, he was ready to make that vision a reality. But for all his reforms, all his beards cut and robes banned, there was one thing Peter knew above all else. True power came from the sea. Russia was vast. Its land stretched farther than any European kingdom, but it was caged by ice and borders. Without ports, Russia was like a bear chained to a forest floor, while the other empires of Europe sailed freely across oceans. To the south, the Ottoman Empire controlled the warm waters of the Black Sea. To the west, the powerful kingdom of Sweden held the Baltic Sea, guarding the routes that led to Western Europe. Peter needed a window to the west. He needed a port. And he knew there was only one way to get it: war. Peter's eyes turned to the Swedish Empire, led by a young and fearless king, Charles XII. Sweden was not the largest kingdom, but its military was feared across Europe. Swedish armies had humbled Poland, Denmark, and even the Holy Roman Empire. But Peter believed Russia's future lay in the Baltic. And he was willing to bleed his nation dry to seize it. In 1700, Peter formed an alliance with Denmark and Poland, launching the Great Northern War. Their target was the same, Sweden. Peter's army, though reformed, was still young and untested. His soldiers marched toward the Swedish fortress of Narva, confident in their numbers. But Charles XII was not like other kings. He was only 18, but he was a warrior, a man born for battle. As Peter's army surrounded Narva, Charles led a daring counterattack with just 12,000 men against Peter's 40,000. The Russian army was shattered. Thousands died. Peter's soldiers fled through the snow, their bodies freezing as they ran. It was a disaster, Russia's humiliation laid bare before Europe. But Peter did not break. Defeat was nothing new to him. He had seen worse. He had seen his family murdered as a child. He had seen betrayal, rebellion, and blood fill the streets of Moscow. Defeat was only the beginning. Peter retreated, but he rebuilt. His soldiers trained harder, his factories produced more weapons, and his shipyards worked day and night to create a navy that could challenge the Swedes. For 8 long years, Peter fought. The Great Northern War became a test of endurance, a brutal struggle across frozen fields and blood-soaked forests. Swedish victories were swift, but Peter's strength was patience. He could afford to lose battles because he knew that, in the end, Sweden would tire. And in 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Peter's patience was rewarded. Charles XII marched into Russia, leading his army deep into Peter's territory. He believed he could end the war with one decisive blow. But Peter had learned from his failures. He lured the Swedish army into the heart of Russia, stretching their supply lines thin. Then, outside the town of Poltava, Peter struck. The battle was fierce. Cannons roared, musket balls tore through the air, and soldiers fought hand to hand in the dirt. But this time, it was Peter's army that stood firm. This time, the Swedes broke. Charles fled into exile. His army was destroyed. Russia had won. Peter's victory at Poltava changed everything. The myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered. Russia was no longer a backward kingdom, it was now a force to be reckoned with. Peter had his prize. The Baltic Sea was within his grasp. And with it, he would build his empire's future. But Peter was not done. A port was not enough. He wanted a city, one that would stand as a symbol of Russia's rebirth. A city that would rise from nothing, carved from the very earth by the hands of his people. And its name would be St. Petersburg. Peter stood on the shores of the Neva River, gazing out toward the Baltic Sea. The land before him was a swamp, drenched in water, plagued by mosquitoes, and cursed with freezing winds. But in Peter's eyes, it was a blank canvas. Here he would build his capital, a new city, a new Russia. St. Petersburg would be Peter's window to the west. It would be his answer to the cities of Europe, a place of grandeur, trade, and power. But the land did not yield easily. Tens of thousands of peasants were dragged to the site, laborers, soldiers, and prisoners. They had no choice. They cut timber, dug trenches, and hauled stone through the freezing mud. Their tools were crude, their boots thin, and their backs bent under the weight of Peter's ambition. Thousands died. Disease swept through the camp, malaria, dysentery, starvation. Some collapsed in the mud and were buried where they fell. Others froze in the brutal winters, their bodies stiff like statues. But Peter did not stop. When his advisors warned him of the death toll, he answered coldly, "Let the dead bury the dead." The work must go on. For 5 long years, the city slowly rose from the swamp. Stone buildings replaced wooden shacks. Wide avenues were laid down, modeled after the great cities of Europe. Canals were carved into the land, giving the city the appearance of Venice. Peter invited European architects to design palaces, government buildings, and churches. He wanted St. Petersburg to be a city unlike any in Russia, a city that looked westward, not east. And when it was done, he made it his capital. The court was moved from Moscow to this new city. Those who resisted, nobles, church leaders, old families, had no choice. Peter had built his vision, and they would live in it. St. Petersburg was more than a city. It was a message to the world. Russia was no longer an isolated kingdom in the East. It was a European power, modern, armed, and ready to shape history. But the cost of Peter's dream was staggering. Tens of thousands had died. Families were shattered. And Peter himself had changed. Years of war, rebellion, and struggle had hardened him. The young boy who had once watched his family die had become a man who ruled with an iron fist. He had executed his enemies, crushed his rivals, and even ordered the torture and death of his own son, Alexei, when he suspected him of treason. Power had made Peter great. But it had also made him cruel. In 1725, Peter the Great died, his body worn down by illness, his mind still restless with ambition. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, a Russia that would shape the world for centuries. But his legacy was not just one of power. It was a legacy of change, of a nation dragged into the future, whether it wanted to go or not. Some remember him as a visionary, a modernizer, the father of the Russian Empire. Others remember him as a tyrant, a man who built his dream upon the bones of his own people. But there is one truth that no one can deny. Peter the Great changed Russia forever. Peter the Great had built his city. St. Petersburg stood as a symbol of power and progress, a European city on Russian soil, a gateway to the West. His navy now patrolled the Baltic, his armies held their ground across Eastern Europe, and his enemies, from the Ottomans to the Swedes, had learned to fear his name. But behind the grand facades of palaces and government halls, cracks were forming, within his empire, within his family, and within Peter himself. Because power, absolute power, always comes with a price. Peter had spent his life fighting against the past, dragging Russia into the future by sheer force of will. But the old Russia was not so easily erased. Even as Peter's reforms reshaped the military, the government, and the culture, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The boyars, the noble families, still whispered against him, their beardless faces hiding their hatred. The church, stripped of much of its influence, saw him as a tyrant who had sold Russia's soul to the West. The peasants, millions of them, lived as they always had, bound to the land, burdened by taxes, and crushed under the weight of their labor. For them, Peter's modern Russia was a distant dream, a world of palaces and fleets they would never touch. But the greatest threat to Peter's legacy would not come from his enemies. It would come from his own blood. Peter's son, Tsarevich Alexei, was everything Peter was not. Where Peter was bold and aggressive, Alexei was quiet and cautious. Where Peter loved war and progress, Alexei clung to tradition, the old Russia of faith, ceremony, and stability. And Peter saw this as betrayal. Alexei was the heir to the throne, the future Tsar. But to Peter, he was a danger, a threat to everything he had built. Peter demanded strength, obedience, vision. But Alexei wanted peace. He wanted to undo his father's reforms, to return Russia to what it had been before Peter's iron hand took hold. Father and son became enemies. Their relationship turned cold, distant, poisoned by suspicion and disappointment. Alexei fled Russia, seeking refuge in Vienna under the protection of the Habsburg Empire. For Peter, this was not just defiance, it was treason. A Tsarevich, the heir to the Russian throne, turning to a foreign power for protection. It was the ultimate insult, the ultimate threat. Peter would not allow it. He sent his agents across Europe, hunting his own son. Alexei was found, captured, and brought back to Russia in chains. But Peter was not content with exile or imprisonment. He wanted to break his son, to make him confess, to make him submit. In 1718, Alexei was dragged before his father, bound, beaten, and afraid. Peter ordered his son to be tortured. The Tsarevich, once destined to rule, was whipped, beaten with rods, and interrogated for days. Each strike of the cane was a message from Peter. There is no room for weakness in Russia. Alexei's body gave out before his will did. He died from his injuries, killed by his father's command. Peter had won. He had destroyed the last threat to his vision. But in doing so, he had destroyed a part of himself. Because the man who had built Russia's future had killed his own future. Peter was left with a throne, but no heir he trusted. A kingdom, but no son to continue his legacy. The Tsar who had defied armies, storms, and rebellions had lost his greatest battle, the battle for his own family. And deep within him, a question began to form. Had the price of his dream been too high? Peter the Great had secured his empire, but his heart was scarred. The death of his son haunted him. Those closest to him whispered that Peter had aged in ways that no war or rebellion had ever managed. His eyes seemed more tired, his once endless energy dampened by guilt. But Peter was not a man to dwell in sorrow for long. He threw himself back into his work, building, reforming, expanding, trying to outrun the shadow of what he had done. He tightened his grip on Russia even further. The military grew stronger. The navy expanded. St. Petersburg became a symbol of power across Europe. But Peter had changed. He ruled with more suspicion, more paranoia. He saw threats everywhere. Courtiers were arrested on whispers of betrayal. Officials who resisted his reforms vanished, executed, imprisoned, or sent to die in Siberia. The boyars bowed lower. The church kept its head down. But fear was everywhere. Even those who admired Peter for his vision knew the Tsar's wrath was never far away. By 1724, Peter's health began to fail. Years of war, work, and stress had taken their toll. But Peter was not a man to rest. Even as his body weakened, his spirit burned as fiercely as ever. In November 1724, he received word that a group of sailors had become stranded during a storm on the Gulf of Finland. Despite his failing health, Peter personally led a rescue mission into the freezing waters. He saved the men, but he paid the price. The cold waters worsened his illness. Fever gripped him. Pain racked his body. For weeks he fought, just as he had fought all his life. But this was a battle he could not win. On February 8, 1725, Peter the Great, Tsar of all Russia, died. He was 52 years old. The man who had dragged Russia out of the shadows, who had crushed rebellions, built cities and defeated empires, was gone. His last words, scribbled on paper in his weak hand, were never finished. They simply read, "Give all to..." But no one knows what he intended to say. Some believe he wanted to name his wife, Catherine, as his successor. Others believe he meant to give his legacy to Russia itself. But the truth died with him. What Peter left behind was not just a crown, it was a new Russia. A Russia with ports on the Baltic, a navy that sailed the seas, and an army that Europe feared. A Russia with St. Petersburg, his city, his dream, standing as a monument to his vision. But he also left behind scars. Tens of thousands had died to build his empire. Families had been torn apart. His own son had been killed by his hand. To some, Peter the Great was a hero, the father of modern Russia. To others, he was a tyrant, a ruler who forced progress at the cost of human life. But one thing is certain, Peter changed Russia forever. The nation he built would go on to become one of the most powerful empires in history. But the question remains, was it worth the price? Peter the Great was dead. The man who had ruled with an iron hand, who had dragged Russia from medieval isolation into modern Europe, was gone. But his shadow lingered over the empire he had built. His death left a void, one that could not easily be filled. Peter had reigned as both a visionary and a tyrant, his will shaping every corner of Russian life. Without him, there was no clear successor, no heir with his strength or vision. His son Alexei was dead, killed by Peter's own hand. The Romanov family, though powerful, was divided, suspicious of each other, uncertain of the future. In the days following his death, the Russian court was gripped by tension and fear. Who would lead? Would the boyars try to seize back their power? Would Peter's reforms be undone? Or would Russia fall into another period of chaos? But Peter had left one last surprise. Before his death, he had elevated his second wife, Catherine, to the status of empress. Catherine had been born a peasant, a servant in Peter's household. But through her charm, intelligence and loyalty, she had won his heart, and his trust. Now, with Peter gone, Catherine was crowned as Russia's first empress. Her reign would be brief, just 2 years, but it would set a precedent. For the first time in Russian history, a woman held the throne. But Catherine ruled not as a rival to Peter's vision, but as its protector. She defended his reforms, continued his policies, and kept Russia on the path Peter had carved with blood and iron. Yet, even as Catherine held the empire together, the cracks were still there, hidden beneath the surface. The boyars still hated the Western ways forced upon them. The church still whispered that Peter had corrupted Russia's soul. And the peasants, millions of them, still labored in poverty and servitude, their suffering unchanged by Peter's dreams. Peter had built a powerful Russia, but he had not built a united one. The cost of his vision, the death, the suffering, the fear, would not be forgotten. And in the decades to come, Russia would struggle to decide what it truly was, a European empire, or a kingdom bound to its ancient traditions. Peter had opened a door to the West, but he had also left Russia standing between two worlds, never fully European, never fully its old self. That tension would define Russia's future, shaping its politics, its rulers and its people, for centuries to come. Because Peter had not simply changed Russia's borders, he had changed its identity. And identity is not so easily rewritten. But Peter's influence would stretch even further, beyond his death, beyond Russia's borders, into the very heart of European power. Because the Romanovs, his dynasty, would not just survive. They would rise. And the empire Peter built would become one of the most feared and powerful forces in the world. The Romanov dynasty, strengthened by Peter's reforms and military victories, would rule Russia for nearly 200 more years. His successors, empresses like Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, and later Tsars like Alexander and Nicholas, would build upon his foundation. Under Catherine the Great, Russia would expand further, conquering Crimea, pushing into Central Asia, and asserting its power across Eastern Europe. The navy Peter built would become a symbol of Russian dominance in the Baltic and the Black Sea. The army he modernized would march across the battlefields of Europe, fighting Napoleon, crushing uprisings, and shaping the balance of power. But Peter's vision, the fusion of Western progress and Russian tradition, would always remain fragile. Every ruler after Peter struggled with the same question: how much of the West should Russia embrace? Some, like Catherine the Great, pushed forward, embracing European culture, philosophy, and science. Others, like Nicholas I, turned back, clamping down on dissent, strengthening the grip of the church and the boyars. That tension, between reform and control, between progress and tradition, became the heartbeat of Russian history. Peter's city, St. Petersburg, became the symbol of that dual identity. It was a European capital built on Russian soil, a place of art, culture, and diplomacy, but also a place of suffering, built on the backs of thousands who died in its construction. Even today, St. Petersburg stands as a reminder of Peter's dream, the city where Russia reaches toward the West, but still carries the weight of its past. But Peter's greatest legacy, the one that would echo long after his death, was not just his army, his navy, or his city. It was the idea that Russia could be more, that it was not bound to isolation, that it could shape the world, not just endure it. Peter planted that seed, through his victories, his reforms, and his brutal will. And that belief, that Russia could be great, would inspire leaders long after him. It would fuel Catherine's conquests. It would drive Alexander to defeat Napoleon. It would give Stalin the vision to forge the Soviet Union into a superpower. But it would also carry a curse, the curse of power built on fear. Because Peter's way, his absolute control, his crushing of dissent, became the model for many Russian rulers after him. Power in Russia became something to be seized, held tightly, and defended at all costs. And the people, so often left behind in Peter's march toward progress, would continue to pay the price. From the Romanovs to the Soviets, from Stalin to Putin, that legacy of power, progress, and control has never truly left Russia. Peter the Great built an empire. But he also built a struggle that lives on in every chapter of Russian history. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy of all. Because Peter did not just change Russia, he made it question what it truly is. And that question remains unanswered, even today. Peter the Great was a ruler like no other. A man who towered over his people, not just in height, but in vision. A man who tore Russia from the grip of its past, dragging it, kicking and screaming, into a new age. He built cities where there were only swamps. He forged a navy from nothing. He defeated enemies that had once seemed invincible. And he turned Russia into a European power, an empire that would shape global history for centuries. But he did so at a price few would be willing to pay. Thousands died to build his dream, laborers, soldiers, and even his own son. The streets of St. Petersburg were paved with sacrifice. The palaces of the Romanovs stood on the bones of the forgotten. To some, Peter was a visionary, the father of modern Russia. To others, he was a tyrant, a man who ruled through fear and blood. But what do you think? Was Peter the Great a hero, or a despot? Did his vision justify the suffering he caused? Or could Russia have found a different path, one without the pain and cruelty he inflicted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because history is not just about kings and empires, it's about the choices we make, and the price we are willing to pay for progress. And the story of Peter the Great is a story we are still writing today. Because every nation, every leader, still faces the same question: how far will we go to achieve power? And how much are we willing to sacrifice to shape the future? Peter the Great's legacy did not end with his death. His city, St. Petersburg, stands to this day, a monument to his vision. His empire, the Russian Empire, would grow to become one of the largest in history. His dynasty, the Romanovs, would rule for nearly 2 more centuries, shaping the fate of Russia and the world. But the questions Peter left behind remain. Even today, Russia stands between East and West, torn between its past and its future. The same struggle that Peter began still echoes in the halls of the Kremlin. Leaders still wrestle with the balance of power and progress. The people still bear the weight of those choices. And the world still watches Russia, wondering which path it will choose. The story of Peter the Great is not just Russia's story, it is a story of power, ambition, and sacrifice. A reminder that the pursuit of greatness often comes with a terrible cost. But it is also a story of possibility. Of what can be built, even in the harshest lands, even against the greatest odds, when vision and will collide. And so, as we look at the world today, at rising powers, shifting alliances, and the ever-present struggle for dominance, Peter's story asks us to consider: what kind of future are we building? And what price are we willing to pay to create it? If you found this journey through history compelling, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that shape the world. And if you want to see another tale of power, ambition, and sacrifice, watch our documentary on Catherine the Great, the woman who would take Peter's empire to new heights. Because history is not over. It lives with us. And the choices we make today will become the stories they tell tomorrow.